All right, so now we're switching to chapter 10 and photosynthesis. So like I said before, photosynthesis is actually basically just the reverse reaction of cellular respiration. So during photosynthesis, inorganic carbon in the form of carbon dioxide reacts with water using energy from the sun to produce sugars and oxygen. So we've put glucose here as our sugar molecule because it makes a nice, neat, balanced equation. But it's not usually glucose directly that's produced by cellular respiration. So as we mentioned before, photosynthesis absorbs energy. In other words, it's endergonic. It has a positive value for delta G. It's non-spontaneous. It's building complex organic molecules, so it's anabolic. And the products of photosynthesis are the reactants for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is a lot more complex than photosynthesis as far as the steps that we're going to be interested in. So organisms that have to consume organic material to get energy are called heterotrophs. Okay? Organisms that can produce organic molecules from inorganic molecules are called autotrophs. And most of the autotrophs that we're familiar with are photoautotrophs, which use energy from sunlight to build those organic molecules. There are also chemoautotrophs that use energy from chemical reactions to build organic molecules that are microbes that we don't come in contact with very often. So when we think about photosynthesis, we got to think about our structure of our chloroplasts. So going back to chapter 5, our chloroplasts have a double membrane on the outside, and then they have these stacks of membrane on the inside. So these stacks of membranes are called the thylakoid membranes. And the fluid-filled space here is called the stroma. And it's these two different locations, which are the locations of the steps of photosynthesis. The thylakoids are actually the part of the chloroplast that are green because they contain the pigment chlorophyll. And it's the chlorophyll that helps with the first step of photosynthesis, which are called the light reactions. And then the second step of photosynthesis, which happens in the stroma, is called the Calvin cycle. These are sometimes also called the dark reactions because they're not directly dependent on light. All right, so the pigment chlorophyll is able to do work because it can absorb energy from the sun. So we're going to go through the individual steps. This looks really complicated, but it's actually the same chart that we went through for cellular respiration, but only 2 steps instead of 4 this time. So just a little note, our nice, neat, balanced chemical equation is actually a lie. We use this nice, balanced chemical equation, but it's a little more complex than that. We actually need water as a reactant, but water is also produced in the process. So we need 12 water molecules to produce 1 glucose, but we actually make 6 water molecules as products. So net, we just need these 6 water molecules in our nice, neat, balanced equation. All right, so photosynthesis is the reverse of cellular respiration. During cellular respiration, glucose becomes oxidized and oxygen becomes reduced. During photosynthesis, the flow of electrons is going in the opposite direction. Okay? So it's the carbon that becomes reduced and the water that becomes oxidized. We're going to strip electrons out of the water molecule this time and produce oxygen. And we're going to pass the electrons to carbon dioxide to form sugars. Okay? And so doing this reverse reaction requires a source of energy. It's endergonic, non-spontaneous. It has a positive value for delta G. And the source of that energy is the sun. All right, so we have these 2 steps, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. And so we need to talk a little bit about light before we talk about the light reactions. So light is a form of energy that travels in waves. We can actually describe light as either a wave or a particle. And the wavelength tells us how much energy and what color the light is. So light's actually a kind of energy that's on this electromagnetic spectrum. And visible light comes in the different colors. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy it has. And if you have something that has a shorter wavelength than violet, you have ultraviolet radiation. On the other end of the spectrum, as the wavelengths go up, the energy is going down. And beyond the red end of the spectrum, we have infrared light. Okay? So one way to describe the light is what wavelength it has. Another way to describe light is as a particle, and we'll get to that in a minute. So pigments are substances that absorb light in the wavelengths that we can perceive by eye. Okay? And different pigments absorb light at different wavelengths. Whatever object you're looking at, the wavelengths of light that are absorbed, you don't see. What you see is what's reflecting off of or bouncing off of those pigments. So if you're wearing a blue shirt, different wavelengths of light are being absorbed and the blue is bouncing off or being reflected. So that's true for chlorophyll as well. Chlorophyll looks green because it's the green wavelength of light that's reflected and bouncing off, whereas the other wavelengths of light, like red and blue, are absorbed. And only absorbed light can do work. Only absorbed energy can do work. And so it's the blue and red wavelengths of light that drive photosynthesis, not green. So we can actually measure this. We can test different wavelengths of light and see where the different pigments absorb and where the plants do the most photosynthesis. There's actually two different isoforms of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and they absorb light in the blue end of the spectrum and the red end of the spectrum. Excuse me, this is absorption up here. But in the green area, that's where the light's being reflected off, and so no energy is being absorbed. Where the energy is being absorbed by the pigments, that's where the most photosynthesis happens and the most oxygen is released. In the green area of the spectrum, where that light is being reflected off, no work is being done. You can also do kind of a 5th grade science experiment like this. You can have 4 different plants, one that has just clear saran wrap on top, one that has blue, one that has green, and one that has red saran wrap on top. And what you'll see is that if you filter out the green light, the plants don't care. They're going to grow just as well as if they had the clear saran wrap. But if you filter out blue light or filter out red light, they won't be able to access that source of energy and the plants won't grow as well. Another way to describe light is as a particle. So a particle of light is called a photon. And what happens when a photon of light hits the chlorophyll molecule is it jumps the electrons up to this excited state. Now, if we just had chlorophyll in a beaker and we shined light on it, the electrons would get excited, they'd jump up, and then if we shut the light off, those electrons would lose their energy and they'd fall back down. And as they were falling down, they would release that energy in the form of heat and light. And the beaker would actually phosphoresce, would actually glow kind of a very faint red, and also release energy as heat. Okay? So it's this excited electron that's actually going to drive the first step of photosynthesis. Just like for cellular respiration, there's a handout and a chart you can fill out to help you organize the steps of photosynthesis. So for the light reactions, we're going to start in the thylakoid membranes, which is where our pigment chlorophyll is. All right, and our starting material for the light reactions, what we need are water, we need sunlight, and what happens in the light reactions is when light hits the chlorophyll molecules, the electrons get jumped up, the electrons from water get jumped up into a high energy state. So the first thing that happens during the light reactions is electrons get stripped out of water. And oxygen gas gets produced as a waste product. Okay? Now, these excited electrons actually go through an electron transport chain, and as they get transferred through this electron transport chain, energy is released and passed to form ATP. So ATP is actually made through oxidative phosphorylation during photosynthesis, and we're going to look more in that in a moment. There's actually two different kinds of chlorophyll and two different kinds of photosystems. So the one that works first is actually called photosystem 2, which is annoying. And the one that acts second is called photosystem 1. What happens in photosystem 1 is those electrons that have passed through the electron transport chain get excited again in this second chlorophyll complex. And then when they go through another electron transport chain, this time instead of making ATP, they make a reduced electron carrier called NADPH. Now the P is actually for a phosphate group, but I remember that NADPH is the reduced electron carrier in plants. The P is for plants. So your book has this kind of cute picture to help you understand what's happening during the light reactions. So the electrons that got stripped out of water get jumped up to a high energy level by the energy from the sun. They go down one energy level. Their energy gets released as they go through the electron transport chain, and some energy is transferred to ATP. And then they get jumped up again by more light in photosystem 1, and then their energy gets released as they get passed through another electron transport chain to produce NADPH. Electron transport chains in the chloroplast are set up in a different orientation than our mitochondria. The electron transport chain in chloroplasts pump hydrogen ions into the thylakoid membranes. There's also an ATP synthase enzyme, so when they diffuse down their concentration gradient, they're diffusing out into the stroma. And ATP is out here in the stroma of the chloroplast. Now, I want you to note something. Chloroplasts make ATP, but all of the ATP that they make is going to get used up in the next step in the Calvin cycle. So chloroplasts do not replace mitochondria in plants. Plants have mitochondria. Plants have to do cellular respiration to make the excess ATP to do cellular work. All the ATP that's made by the chloroplast is used up by the chloroplast. That ATP that was produced in the light reactions and the reduced electron carrier NADPH are going to be used up in the next step, which is the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions. So this step is happening in the stroma, in the fluid-filled space inside the chloroplast, outside the thylakoid membranes. And the energy from the sun is now stored in our ATP and our reduced electron carrier NADPH. The other reactant that we need for this part is carbon dioxide, our source of carbon. Okay? And what happens is through a series of steps, okay, the enzyme rubisco starts the process of fixing carbon, building carbon into organic molecules. And the product is sugar. Now, technically, the actual sugar that's produced is called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. It's not glucose directly. And then later, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate gets converted into glucose and other sugars. So during the Calvin cycle, all the ATP gets used up. There's no extra ATP lying around. And our electron carrier loses its electrons and passes them to carbon dioxide to form sugar molecules. So during photosynthesis, we have the opposite process happening in cellular respiration. It's the water that is becoming oxidized and the carbon that's becoming reduced to build sugars. All right, so this figure summarizes the same information as in our chart. Okay, during the light reactions, which occur in the thylakoids, water is split, electrons are stripped out to produce ATP and NADPH. Oxygen is released as a waste product, and then the energy from the sun that's now stored in ATP and NADPH are used up during the Calvin cycle, along with carbon dioxide, to produce sugar molecules. Thing to think about. You have an oak tree in your backyard. If you measure the biomass, the carbon that's in it, the dry weight of the tree, where did that carbon come from? Pause and think about it. It's not from the soil, it's not from the water, it's not from the fertilizer, it's not through the roots, it's from the air. Trees have built inorganic carbon dioxide into organic molecules to form all of the structures present in that plant and present in you and I.